The 1970 cyclone, which affected the islands off the eastern side of then East Pakistan, are thought to have killed anywhere from 250 to 400,000 people. When it occurred, of course, there was very little communication with these islands. There were no satellite pictures. There was no mobile phones, obviously. But people knew that it was a severe event. The president of Pakistan, General Yahya Khan, rather than going to that site, as I recall, because this is by memory here, went on to meetings in China, sort of overflew East Pakistan, and people were infuriated by this, that the president had thought so little of one wing of the country that he overflew. And subsequently, the Awami League, that was under the leadership of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, swept the election in East Pakistan, and therefore got a majority in parliament. And there are those who feel that the neglect or the disinterest that was shown by the head of Pakistan itself, and the West Wing particularly, contributed to the defeat of that government. Natural disasters have played major roles in political situations, as occurred in this country. There's no doubt in my mind that the displeasure with then President Bush was very much triggered by the response of his administration and some of his appointees to the Katrina hurricane. Whether they were at fault or not, we could argue, but the perception of the public was very much that this was not dismissed, but was not given the importance that people felt it should. And I think that this contributed to a lot of the great displeasure with his administration. And this has happened in many, many situations globally, where natural disasters have killed and made homeless hundreds of thousands, millions of people over this time. And it is the administration's response to that and their sense of concern and caring that affects oftentimes the public's view of that administration. And that certainly was the case in Pakistan and led to the dismemberment of the country, among other things. It was building for a long time, but this was it's more than a straw, I'd say, the log that broke the camel's back. If one looks, you can see that Bangladesh is basically a river delta, the Brahmaputra and the Ganges coming together, and much of Bangladesh is the silt that they deposit. Bangladesh is one of the few countries in the world that is actually growing, at least until global warming came along. And so you have floods coming down from the Himalayas, and the elevation from the Tibetan plateau, which is at 14 or 15,000 feet, down to the plains of Bengal is very, very acute. Now, also coming down from the north, coming up from the south are cyclones, and you can see that it's a perfect tunnel. That is, the cyclones form in the Bay of Bengal and then move up and will either hit Bangladesh, which is directly north, or sometimes they veer off to hit Orissa and West Bengal and India, or in an instance that occurred a few years back into Myanmar, which caused great destruction. But most of them come straight up the Bay of Bengal and hit Bangladesh. And so every year there's one or two cyclones of varying degrees of intensity that affect the country. And a lot of the destruction then, of course, depends on where and when it hits. If it hits at high tide, the tidal bore, which is what causes most of the destruction, It's not caused by the wind. This is a misconception on the part of people. It is the tidal bore, the water that is pushed ahead of the cyclonic winds, the hurricane winds that caused most of the damage, as was the case in Katrina as well. So it's this sort of, it's almost like a slow-moving tsunami, and that's what causes the destruction. So there's that, and then from the north, at another time of year, you have the floods. So they're kind of, in terms of natural disasters, I suspect that Bangladesh suffers more than just about any country. Well, I think the first thing that any relief program must consider, particularly on the coastal areas, is making sure people have access to potable, to drinkable water. Because you can live without food for a fairly long period of time, but you can't live without water. And the salt water from the bay gets in and contaminates ponds, which sometimes people get their water from, or tube wells and so on. So you have to make sure people get access to water as soon as possible. Obviously, food is a major issue as well. And here you want to make sure that the food doesn't require cooking, at least in the first 4 or 5 days, that people can consume it without having to build a fire and so on. And there are, these types of foods are available, and they're common in the country. And then, of course, you need shelter becomes an issue, and clothes, and especially the means for economic recovery. It's very interesting that in the 1970 cyclone, the quick and dirty epidemiologic studies actually concluded that the population that was left on the affected islands was healthier than the population on the mainland. Well, that's understandable because all the weak, the infirm, the aged had simply been washed out to sea. And what people really needed once you get past food and water is the means to economic recovery. Seeds, boats, cattle, whatever it is that people are going to use to try to get their livelihood and their life back together. And so these can be anticipated. You can get some idea of what it is that folks need. And if it's a farming community, they need the means to recover, to get back. Sometimes that's not so easy because there may be waterlogging in these areas, the land may be severely affected, and so on. And again, I think those people who deal with these issues are learning more and more as to how to provide the means for people to recover economically. Because if you recover from the cyclone, the initial cyclone, but you have no means of getting money, where are you in all of this? You're going to have to migrate out of the area. It causes its own form of delayed destruction. So there's the event itself, there's the acute response to that event, and then there's the long-term consequences, which I think people are spending more and more time addressing and understanding. Well, I would put them in different categories. One is the observations that they themselves have made through very quick epidemiologic studies. Where did it hit, and who dies, who's affected? And of course they found early on that it was women, children, the elderly who are most affected by these tidal bores, particularly because they're weaker, they're more vulnerable. That those who survive tend to be able to access at least the second story of a building. That there are buildings there, or they can climb trees, but that if they can get up about to the second story, their chance of survival is much greater. On the basis of these observations, then, the government, with outside aid, began to construct cyclone shelters within certain spatial characteristics, within maybe 1.5 kilometers of a of a population center and so on. Initially, they were simply built to house people during these events, and then they found out that they were not cared for and abandoned and so on, so they began to put more effort into making these dual purpose centers, schools, mosques, government buildings, clinics, whatever, so that these cyclone shelters would also serve another purpose and therefore be kept up. They also found that, that people would oftentimes stay at home too long to protect their few assets, especially cattle and so on. So could they then design these so that there would be places for people to bring their cattle? Now that's the epidemiologic observations and the ways that they dealt with this, including making sure that water was available whenever possible and so on. Then, of course, there's the technology that comes from satellite early warning systems. We now can track these. We know where they're going pretty much. Mobile phones have made a huge difference, of course, because now people can literally tell you what's happening when and where. And over time, voluntary organizations developed. There's something like 40,000. I don't know the name of the organization, but people who go out and make sure people are warned ahead of time and that they do what is necessary to try to mitigate the impact. Remember, these events occur in a very short period of time. The winds build up and build up, but the tidal bore, which, as I noted, is the devastating part of these cyclones, is come and goes within 24 hours. The waters sweep in and then they go out to sea, and you can get caught either direction. So you don't need long-term shelters. You don't need places for people to stay for a week or two. In fact, the whole strategy has been to get people back to their homes, back to where they live as quickly as possible. Because if you gather people in places, you risk the possibility of increasing disease, lots of other things. And so because these events are relatively short term, the waters come in, they go out, the wind dies down. The strategy has been, either by default or by design, to get people back to their homes as quickly as possible to begin to rebuild and put their life back together.